Well, I think what it boils down to is I come from a planning background, and that planning background has a lot of societal issues that planners have to think about. And I recall joining the Harbor Commission in Toronto, which focused on creating satellite areas for teleports and the idea of a World Trade Center movement. And they all that was a kind of a perfect storm that kind of brought together some planning thinking around, well, what happens if you pull those entities together, those activities and ideas together, and you actually extend it into the community at large. And that started to cause me to think about these things.
But also in telecom also, I mean. The
telecom part was part of it, right?
Yeah.
So
No, it was 21 years ago.
it was over 21 years
That's
ago.
right.
It was like 25 years ago
We've
or
been giving
more.
out awards for 15.
But this was in the late 70s, early 80s when we were beginning to think in those terms. And then later 80s when I was with the Harbor Commission, where we started to have these actual conversations. We started to be involved with the World Teleport Association, started writing things, and it just kind of pulled together from that point of view.
But what you were saying with telecom, we actually were the first guys to be thinking about the relationship between telecom and economic development.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at that time, as you know, those were two separate disciplines. They never talked to each other. But we started looking at the connection. You know, we started to say, from the satellite industry, the first broadband community, right? What can we do here when 3 satellites in geosynchronous orbit can make one footprint over the Earth? So what does that do to economic development? And for me, that was very personal because I grew up in a small town that everybody was leaving, as it turned out in the rest of the world. And I was beginning to think, just sort of emotionally, that if there was a way to have kept that little beautiful place intact, then we could make a difference in the world. So the technical stuff, was sort of secondary to the need to keep the community intact, or really to understand what happened to the place where I grew up. And I think in a lot of ways that drives people without them even knowing it. There's an emotional absence that's taking place because communities get sort of eviscerated. And I always believe that if we could get those problems sorted out, then the rest of them at the national levels might sort themselves out, because you would be finding problems where people actually live.
And of course, there's a complete different side to that, right? There's the places that have been naturally benefiting from the convergence of the physical network of the city with the information and communications network that we're lying on top of it, and places like New York, natural places that are going to win. Even they are being challenged to figure out what their future's like, because as we now know, you don't necessarily have to be there to make a living.
Exactly.
But I want to go back to '95. You organized a conference in Toronto in 1995, Smart 95, which was the first time I ever heard about this topic.
Yeah,
up in Toronto.
But that was an interesting evolution, because when I was on the World Teleport Association board, there were all these teleport guys, satellite guys, cablehead guys, and I was the only person there that was talking planning. And there was a real friction, as you may recall. For many years, they didn't like the topics that I was raising because it confused the whole satellite industry.
Right.
They were very industry-led. I was trying to bring it back to, what did this all mean from a community point of view? So this actually started in the late 80s as part of the conversation after we started to go to the early World Teleport activities in places like Japan or in Munich and so forth.
Kuala Lumpur, remember
coming out of those places, I couldn't help but think somehow this needs to translate back to people and to community building. But the World Teleport guys couldn't get it, and they couldn't really help me until we separated from that group and really moved the movement forward after 1999. But back in the early 1990s, the key there was, how do we take this and kind of expand the conversation on a global level? So by holding an event in Toronto, which was a World Teleport event, but we renamed it to be Smart 95 and started talking about things like, well, there's smart people and there's smart buildings. Is there such a thing as a smart community or a smart city? And out of that, was, in fact, the first smart community conference in the world.
Yeah.
And you guys were there.
Well, yeah, of course. We were there. We actually got smarter.
We did.
That day,
well,
yeah.
some of us.
You know what's weird though? The satellite industry, now they're starting to come back to the proposition that we put forward 21 years ago.
Yep.
Now they're delivering broadband, they're offering it for education, for telemedicine, all the things that we sort of envisioned would be happening or that were possible. That industry has now sort of rediscovered it. You see it with the NBN down in Australia, right? They're using satellites that connect remote areas.
I was just speaking with a senior executive at one of the big satellite companies who said they're going to redefine who they are. They're not going to stop talking about being a satellite company. They're a broadband provider.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.